Erving Goffman applied Shakespeare's work to his analysis of society. So Shakespeare stated, "All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players. They have their exits and their entrances, and one man in his time plays many parts." So Goffman takes this and applies it to society. We are all actors, and how we act depends on the audience. His main concept is impression management, which is handled through the definition of the situation, expressions and impressions, and his analysis of our front stage and backstage social interactions. For Goffman, all social interactions involve attempting to persuade others of your definition of the situation. So here's an example from a textbook of interactions between salespeople and customers. If you're buying a phone or a car, the salesperson is going to attempt to construct a definition of the situation that benefits them. They'll try to suggest that you need to have this high end, pricier product because you're a discerning individual with good taste, while you're trying to construct a different definition of the situation, which suggests that while you appreciate quality, you also have financial considerations, but you don't want to appear cheap either. So it becomes somewhat of a struggle. Furthermore, a good sales representative will try to persuade you that they're not really sales representatives at all. They'll try to convey sincerity, as well as try to gauge the level of intimacy they can have with you. They'll attempt to make connections with your interests, try to keep the transaction more like a friendly conversation than a sales pitch. You are, however, also aware of the fact that they're salespeople and you're trying not to provide them too much information that they could use in their efforts to persuade you. So we create definitions of the situation, and we create impressions by our expressions through this process. And there are two different kinds of expressions. The expressions we give, which are primarily the things we say, the intentional poses, the intentional facial expressions we make, smile, surprise, etc., and other controlled body language. The expressions we give off are the elements of our expressiveness over which we have less control. There are inconsistencies between what we say and what we actually do. This is the body language that gives us away in some situations, that which we don't predict, that we're not in control of. The expressions we give off might not be interpreted the way we want them to be interpreted. We might give off impressions that people interpret incorrectly. So if you look at page 6 of your printout of Goffman's presentation in everyday life, presentation of self in everyday life, he talks about Shetland Island. And this tells us something about impression management. So he states, quote, "For example, in gaining admission to a tight social circle, the participant observer may not only wear an accepting look while listening to an informant, but may also be careful to wear the same look when observing the informant talking to others. Observers of the observer will then not as easily discover where he actually stands. Later, islanders sometimes took pleasure in watching the visitor drop whatever expression he was manifesting and replace it with a sociable one just before reaching the door. However, some visitors, in appreciating that this examination was occurring, would blindly adopt a social face a long distance from the house." Have you ever done this? Maybe before an interview or a meeting, you're preparing for interactions with people, so you put on the right facial expression. You sort of prepare for going into that interaction. Unlike Mead, Goffman is far less interested in exploring the internal conversations that individuals engage in as they map out their conduct. Eddles and Appleruth lay out for us a couple of ways where we can compare the two and contrast the two. While Mead contends that the central elements of social interaction are rooted in one's imagination, Goffman looks to the scene within which individuals orient their actions to one another. For Goffman, then, the essence of the self is found not in the interior cognitive deliberations of the individual, but rather in interaction itself. In the end, both the dynamics of social encounters and the image of oneself are dependent on the willingness of others to, quote, go along with the particular impression that an individual is seeking to present. Now, in class, I usually do a get to know you activity with students where students go around the room and talk with one another, but there's a twist to this activity. Some students are spies, and nobody knows who the spies are except for the spies. The spies in the activity are supposed to make up false narratives about their life. Meanwhile, other students are trying to guess who the spies are. A lot of times, students think other people are spies when they're not. Some of their guesses are correct, some of them aren't. How do students determine if someone is a spy? Well, they'll notice things like whether or not the person makes eye contact, whether or not they hesitate when answering a question. This has to do with Goffman's impressions given and impressions given off. Students who are spies describe how they attempt to go backstage. So when we come together as a class and I ask the spies, how did you manage this? So some of them will actually go to a corner of the room and they'll think about, give themselves some time to construct a fake story, preparing for the performance that they're about to give. Many students suspect that their classmates are spies, but they're hesitant to name them. Well, what does this have to do with? This has to do with Goffman's concept of face work. Students will say that they don't want to doubt the person that they're talking to or falsely accuse them. They would be embarrassed if they turned out to be wrong, so they don't at first say that they're spies or guess that the people that they're talking to are spies. They don't want to admit that. So students will go along with a person's life story even though they have serious doubts about it. So there's a collaborative nature to face work. There's a lot of what Goffman calls agreement in this class activity, which is important to face work. Each participant in an interaction will accept the face of the other person, accept the face that they're trying to present as valid, and they will actually assist the other person in upholding that face that they're trying to present. That's about agreement and audience tact. How do students try to discover if the person they're talking to was a spy? Students often describe how their main technique was to ask difficult questions to try to trip up their conversational partner. The students would describe how they would carefully observe their partner's hand gestures, their facial movements, how quickly they answered the questions, and other nonverbal cues. This again has to do with impression management and the information game, what Goffman calls the information game. This exercise that we do in the classroom is an exaggerated form of what we do on a daily basis. It's not that Goffman is saying we're all liars. It's that even when people are being genuine, they have to manage their impressions to give off the meaning they're trying to express. With face work, Goffman means there's a pressure to save face and help others save face. We usually start discussions from where we're comfortable as well. For students, this means discussing issues that concern them as college students. This aids in the agreement within the interaction. Starting with commonalities, that's a good place to ensure comfortable, agreeable interactions. So on page 7 in your printout, Goffman talks about maintaining agreement. You may not agree with what's being said, but it's important to be agreeable within the situation to get through it. Think about work situations that you have, for example. We experience this all the time in life. Some battles are worth our time and some aren't. Your status positions also matter in these interactions. Being a college student is a status. That's the role students play, and they choose that role to interact with other college students because it's comfortable and readily available. It's a way they can easily relate to each other in activities like this. Now, some might say that during these interactions, quote, I just tried to be myself. I hear that a lot. I was just being myself. But Goffman and Mead might ask, which self? The self you are with your parents, the self you are with your professors, the self you are at home when you're alone, the self you are in an interview, the self you are with friends at a party. I'm a different self with my children than I am with my students. Most students are a different self with their friends than they are with me. There are many selves that they can be with their classmates in this activity or on an everyday basis. Which self are we with different audiences, and how do we choose? And being able to choose different presentations of ourselves, it's not a bad thing. In fact, Goffman would argue that it's necessary for smooth interactions to be able to present a different self depending on the audience. Goffman states that being genuine all the time is not necessary for society to function. And in some cases, it can actually be detrimental to interactions. The impressions we form are also aided by gestures and sign vehicles. The gesture of not making eye contact, looking around the room, can form different impressions for us, and we might interpret it differently depending on the status a person holds. We might interpret it as nervousness for one person or arrogance for another. The gesture itself is meaningless outside of social interaction. So, the sociologist who developed this activity shared the example of a student interpreting her classmates' behavior of not making eye contact and looking around the room as rude and snobby because she knew the classmate was from a sorority. And if she didn't have that information, she might interpret it a different way, for example, as nervousness. Clothing can serve as what Goffman calls a sign vehicle or a significant symbol. We can inform impressions about people based on the clothing they wear. If you review the film People Like Us, which we looked at with Mead and with Weber, you can see clear examples of people making judgments about this. And some of the people who are in the social upper class in that film actually make comments about this, the kinds of words that people use to describe things, the language that they use. This can signify something about a person's social class. Impression management includes your own self-control over your face expressions, your posture, your tone of voice. Do you smile to appear nice and friendly? Do you fix your shirt to look more presentable? Do you lean in to show that you're paying attention? These can be very intentional parts of impression management. There's also audience tact, as I mentioned before. This is, for example, when, like an actor who makes a mistake on stage and they recover, the audience might politely ignore it. They might applaud. We try to politely ignore people's mistakes. That's audience tact. Now, the article that you read focuses mostly on the front stage, but there's also a backstage where you do a lot of that preparation work. A waitress, for example, will try her best to keep a cheery position while she's dealing with customers, even the cantankerous ones, and even if she isn't feeling well, whereas she might go back to the kitchen and talk about these cranky, whiny customers. This would be somewhat more backstage behavior, right? And there's a lot of emotion work involved in this kind of work, which we'll talk about in a bit. Race, class, and gender are visible statuses that are also connected to the front and backstage presentation. So on page 9, Goffman states, in consequence, when an individual projects a definition of the situation and thereby makes an implicit or explicit claim to be a person of a particular kind, he automatically exerts a moral demand upon the others, obliging them to value and treat him in the manner that persons of his kind have a right to expect. Now, again, this depends on status and differences in status and interactions. So there are cases of people of color being questioned at the airport because flight attendants might not believe that they're Dr. So-and-so, for example. In the film Race, the Power of an Illusion, you hear from an African-American professor who talks about how he's constantly approached on campus and asked if he's the basketball coach. And he has to respond, no, I'm a professor in the Department of Life Sciences. The racialized nature of these front and backstage preparation, presentations, and interactions is documented in Joe Fagan and Melvin Sykes' Living with Racism. This is research on middle-class African Americans who have to navigate predominantly white workspaces and neighborhoods. Fagan and Sykes draw on Du Bois' concept of the double consciousness. Their respondents have an understanding that the world views them a certain way, and they use that information and their past experiences with racial discrimination to prepare for interracial interactions. They try to prevent the discrimination. So you have African American respondents in the book who are doctors, they have PhDs, they're lawyers, they're other professionals, but this is not what people see when they're out and about in their predominantly white communities. An African American woman in the book talks about going to the grocery store or to the laundromat and feeling like she has to dress in her business suit to be treated fairly and equally, to not be discriminated against. People make assumptions about her as an African American woman. Leslie Hout's Pickup published a book with Joe Fagan called Two-Faced Racism, in which they interview college students and find that college educated European American students have learned how to talk around racism or about racism. They know what is and is not socially acceptable to say. So they use politically correct language in front of certain audiences and in front of people of color, but when they're around their friends and family or other European Americans, they exhibit more overt kinds of racist thinking. They tell racist jokes, they use racial slurs. This is the racialized front stage and backstage. There's also a gender dynamic through which we can analyze these social interactions using Goffman. Emotion work. This is something that involves attempts to either evoke particular feelings we want or think we should experience, as well as attempts to suppress the experiences of undesired feelings. So jobs typically done by women involve a great deal of emotional labor and emotional energy. This has been studied among flight attendants, waitresses, and care workers. So, for example, flight attendants, they have to exert emotional labor in managing their facial expressions. Smiling becomes a kind of labor. It's a means of controlling the definition of the situation. This is all a front that masks their true feelings, and it's part of the job. It's also connected to what's known as invisible labor. So I'll cover more on racism and gender with Du Bois, Anna Julia Cooper, and Charlotte Perkins Gilman. Here's a list of some of the concepts and ideas to think about from Goffman and in the pages from your printout in his work that you should review.